Oh, hello there, and welcome to Phil Talking D20. So, today's video is a deep dive, is a comparison video between 2E and 5E. That's right, numbers with an E at the end. It must be serious. It is a hopefully light-hearted look at Matt Mercer's latest character in Exandria Unlimited, his dwarven sorcerer, Dariax, who I've quite enjoyed. Watched the first episode. I say watched. Listened to the podcast version of the second episode. About halfway through. No spoilers, please. I'll try. I won't put any spoilers in this either. We're going to take a look at how you can compare 2E and 5E classes and where they differ. And Dariax, he's a very interesting take on Sorcerer in 5E. He's gone the Divine Soul route, which is effectively a cleric sorcerer kind of hybrid in the way that you can cast divine spells, and that all stems from the Bloodline systems, which 5e lifted from Pathfinder 1. I know this because I played 3.5, and back in the dark days of D&D 3.5, as a sorcerer there were no Bloodlines. You got a familiar, and you had to pay 100 gold, and that was it. And spells, obviously. Who you can't be a sorcerer without spells. Now, where we start is with Dwarf, because he chose Dwarf as his race, and that obviously then proffered him to make a choice between Hill Dwarf and Mountain Dwarf. Durga obviously didn't apply, and I really couldn't find any more kind of racial archetypes for dwarves in 5e. Maybe there's a couple more. There probably are some third-party ones. I'm not sure we can count third-party. But that's kind of where they're at. So he chose Mountain Dwarf. Gave him some very cool, unique things. Obviously, it gives him a little +2 to strength on top of his +2 to con. And it gives him the armor proficiency, light and medium, so that he has the ability to use armor. And then obviously the standard stuff, the poison resistance, resilience, etc. His +2 con, his stone cunning, etc. As well as those kind of ancestral weapons that you get given. So already 5e's dwarf makes you adventurer, muck adventure face. That's what it's geared up for. That's what they've kind of targeted. It's just one bang. This is what you get given. On you go. You've chosen which bit you're picking to kind of choose between the two options. Hill Dwarf, Mountain Dwarf. He went Mountain Dwarf, and he's moved on. To put that into comparison with 2E is quite cool, actually, because effectively what happens is with a 2E character, dwarves, as per standard, get +2 con, +2 wisdom, -2 charisma, and a free pick of a +2 to 1 stat. They also get 10 hit points, which is our first touchstone divergence point. Races in 2E give you hit points as well as classes, and dwarves are famous for their robustness and their toughness, and so they chose to reflect that in a big chonking amount of hit points so that you can go into the game with a hearty toughness of a dwarf as opposed to the kind of the frail but elegant beauty of an elf who get fewer racial hit points, to compare and contrast the two species apart from each other in a Tolkien themed Gygax inspired D&D kind of way. However, when we get to the bit where we start talking about resilience and resistance to poison, this is another divergent point in 2E, and that becomes, well, effectively five choices technically if you're using the core book. One of them is poison. So if you really just want to keep playing the poison resistance dwarf, you can still just keep doing that in 2E. But if you want to become resistant to necromancy, because your clan has a history and a legacy of holding back the terrors of the night, and you want to get the ability to have a bonus against necromancy effects, Bob's your uncle. And this is, again, another next step into a touchstone of difference. You have resilience and resistance, and those tend to be a certain amount of damage reduction and or advantage on a save against a particular thing in 5e, whereas in Pathfinder 2 they have built everything around the beat by 10 fail by 10 model and kept it all on one dice and kept the maths in one space, as opposed to deuces are wild with 2 dice to fail or 2 dice to succeed, which mechanically makes the game a bit more predictable, a bit more stable, and puts you in a situation as a character where a DM who is slightly mean and vindictive simply keeps telling you, no, you're rolling with disadvantage, which kind of is basically a GM saying, I really want you to fail. Now, there's a whole conversation to be had about advantage and disadvantage and how mechanically it fits into a game. And a lot of that is GM free will and GM choice, which is a very powerful but also very dangerous tool. What's the phrase in Spider-Man? With great power comes great responsibility. Advantage, disadvantage has that written all over it. Whereas the beat by 10, fail by 10, your only peril is the DC. It's not the DC and disadvantage. And that's kind of what DCs are for. DCs are the thing that define whether something is hard or easy from DC 5 to DC 30, as opposed to it's DC 10, but you've got to roll 2 dice and take the lower. Or it's DC 10, but you can roll twice and take the higher, which is basically just going to succeed. So just yep it, or just say it's DC 10. Anyway, that aside, when you're looking at those kind of divergent points, that resilience resistance now becomes 5 choices that are broad, and they include things like necromancy and poison and various other things, fire, reflective of time spent around forges and furnaces, etc. That is a slight damage reduction against fire effects, but also essentially just the ability to ignore semi-extreme climate. So effectively you can wander around in a desert, and unless it's like Death Valley in the heart of summer, you're probably not going to have to make any environmental saves because you're just a double-R dwarf who spent his generations at the forge in the furnaces around lava lakes and doesn't get sunburn. Brilliant. So you can already see how there is that's an easy word to say, isn't it? A similarity between some of the things that you're being given in 5e and some of the choices that you're making at the same and similar points in 2e. Like I said, they're both numbers with an E on the end, and they are wonderfully similar. You can just pick up and run with a 5e mountain dwarf, and he is a very solid, simple, Tolkien-inspired dwarf. Great, that's good enough. But if you've played that 5 times, and they've all had different names, and they've all been different characters, and they've all been different classes, and you're thinking, yeah, but why are there only mountain dwarves and hill dwarves? And you don't really justify Durga in a party. 2E's got you covered. One of the ones that I'm quite a fan of, and if we're going to look kind of verbatim, mountain dwarf versus 2E, because that's the choice he made, Matt Mercer made, are closest from a narrative perspective, because mountain dwarves, they live up in the mountains, and they've spent the time in the ancient rocks of the mountains, and that's kind of their home and their kind of their place in the world. Rock dwarf in 2E has very similar flavor text, and that's kind of what I'm touching on with this kind of point. Your ancestors lived and worked among the great ancient stones and the mountainous depths of the earth. Do you know what I mean? Text-wise, these two are almost the same, except you gain +2 circumstance bonus on fortitude or reflex saves against shove or trip, and this also applies to saving throws against spell effects that attempt to knock you prone. So it's not giving you the armor and the +2 strength. You don't need the +2 strength. You've already got a lot more pluses to your stats from a 2e kind of base race build anyway. So that's kind of, moot point. What it's doing is it's making it harder for people to knock you down. However, this is an important creative liberal choice that I've made on Matt's behalf, and I'm sure he won't mind, because this is all theoretical, and it's quite a cool one. He's playing a sorcerer, a dwarf sorcerer, and what says magic about sorcerer? It's that you're full of magic. It's literally just everywhere, full of it, because you're innately magical. Something has made you magical from birth. Now, this is where it gets cool, and this is where I take some creative license. Where are we? Okay, so the elemental heart dwarf. Whether through a connection to Dariax Forges, the Azirs of the Plane of Fire, or another source, you can exude a burst of energy once per day. And that does a d6 damage at level 1 to all adjacent foes. And that, obviously, at 3rd and every 2 levels after, increases by d6 in damage. So as you level up, your power that you got from your innate inbuilt connection to the elemental planes increases with you. Now, if you're playing a dwarven sorcerer who's innately full of magic, nothing says dwarven sorcerer to me than being able to literally detonate a fireball from the planes of fire, or or from Dariax Forge itself, to massacre the people around you for reasonably high, mid levels, a couple of d6 extra once per day. When the chips are down and something's trying to mob you, that's pretty sweet, right? So at this juncture, I didn't go with the one that fitted the narrative of Mountain Dwarf from a text perspective. I went with a bit of creative choice. I had more choices. I had more options, let's be clear. And I chose that one because who doesn't want to go, boom, like a Tony Stark moment. And that, I think, in a nutshell, actually, no, that's not true. Let's keep going, because the inbuilt weapon and armor proficiencies that he stacked into his character build are something that's unique to 5e in a kind of a racial build way. You do get in 2e ancestral feats on top of the little things that we just discussed, and one of those is dwarven weapon familiarity. But that gives you classic dwarven weapons like the battle axe and warhammers, etc. So you could slap that feat in and get more weaponry into your sorcerer than you would normally have. But this is stepping into sorcerer, another divergent point between 5e and 2e, and that's weapon proficiencies. No, 2e sorcerers aren't martial weapons experts, but they do have access to all simple weapons. They just have simple weapons proficiency because it's simpler. Because I don't know about you, but whenever I get my 5e character sheet and I'm playing a character where I get this annoying little list of weapons that I can choose specifically, I can't just tick simple weapons proficiency. I have to scribble down specific ones. Oh, I can use darts, can I? Oh, lovely, thanks very much. Can I just have simple weapons proficiency so I can use simple weapons? Yes. So you've got a choice to make at that point as to how important melee weapons are to you as a character, because all of the ancestries in 2e have the option to get access to their ancestral weapons as a feat if they want to choose that during their level 1 character creation. Or they can choose a myriad of other feats. Let me just do a quick check on my numbers to make sure I'm not going bonkers. I think you're looking at six feats from the core 2e book to flavour out your kind of character in that regard at level 1. So you've got that kind of, do I want some weapon proficiencies? Or do I want to take what I get from my class, because that's where they normally come from? If you're a fighter in 2E or 5E, you are proficient with all weapons, armor, and shields because you're a fighter. So the dwarven kind of weapons bit is redundant if you're a dwarven fighter. So having the ability to pick something else in its stead suddenly has a little bit more appeal to it when you start to kind of delve into the kind of minutiae of what you can do with a character. That said, he makes a point of using his spear. You know, he's got this weapon. And so to reflect that, I chose ancestral weaponry so that he could use a couple more weapons to expand his arsenal of simple weapons. Now, we're stepping into the worlds of Sorcerer. Sorcerer grants 6 hit points, or a d6, and at first level in 5e, you max 6, plus your con. So they're exactly the same. Difference being, when you become level 2, in 5e you're rolling, you might get a 1, and then the DM will probably let you re-roll it, because everyone gets to re-roll 1s at every table I've ever been at, so why are you bothering to roll a dice? You just get 6 in 2e. Boom, done. How many hit points? 6. Smashed it. What's my con? Added it. On we go. You can already see at level 1, you're, well, I think he had a con of like 14 or something, so he's got like 8 hit points or something at level 1. As a dwarf, he's quite weedy. They're renowned for their stocky, you know, robustness. They're literally, the flavor text is all about their, you know, strength and fortitude and resilience that they have. Just because he's a sorcerer doesn't mean he's lost that. In 2e, he'd start with 16 to 18 to, you know, well, your con modifier, but roughly around 18 to 20 hit points as a sorcerer at level 1. Slight divergent point here again with 2e. Combat can do a lot more damage in 2e. Not always, it's not a gimme. Often, certainly at low levels, it's very similar to 5e. But with that whole beat by 10, failed by 10 critical system that they employ, criticals can happen a little bit more often than you'd like. It's quite scary. It's a little bit, it's just enough swingy against big bads. Not your everyday kind of mooks. Although, let's be clear, when you're level 1 in any gaming system, every fight feels like a great green dragon, because you already have a small pool of hit points, and it's only a few hits with a d8 plus 2 strength weapon before that's really small, and you're looking at that number going, one more of those and I'm unconscious. So again, from a perspective of how different are they, that experience again is very similar, and you are rolling a d20 and you will be making skill checks and you will be making saves. So there really isn't a huge amount in the rub down at that kind of a juncture. Slight simplifications, little pun there about simple weapons, with not having a finicky little list in 5e, just having simple weapons, get on with it, move on. His armor is an interesting one, because he gets to use light and medium armor by building a mountain dwarf sorcerer, which is a very unique little quirk in that system for sorcerer, because it's not the norm. They're normally clothes or robes, or taking, you know, feats to get access to armor, or however your system breaks down. In 2e, there is a proficiency system. So you remember earlier on I mentioned how 5e robbed Bloodlines from Pathfinder 1? Scandalous. Well, the tables turn. Proficiency is now in Pathfinder 2. Except they've made it less abstract and more straightforward. I remember with 3rd edition 3.5, even 4th edition and earlier editions, you had base attack bonus, and then you had different columns for saves, and they were different numbers, but they were all kind of standardized around an amount. They would go up and down depending on your level. 5e really boiled that down to a, we'll take a kind of weaker mid-range point and say that that's just your proficiency, and it will go up every so often. In 2e, it's either trained, untrained, expert, master, legendary, and that's basically your level, and then it kind of stacks up from there. So it's kind of quite familiar to you if you remember 3rd edition. If you look at a trained character's base attack bonus, it's their level, easy peasy. As opposed to if you're an expert, it's your level +2. So the sorcerer will start with a trained unarmored armor class, whereas he started, I think, with a chain shirt from reading notes and what people have written on the internet, which I think is 13 plus his dex modifier, which means he's got the armor class of 15, which someone told me was good in 5e, and I kind of went, oh, is it? Because 15's not brilliant, but the numbers are lower, so actually, when you think about it, that's true, because it's probably for kind of weaker combatants, that's probably just over 50% chance of rolling the number on the d20 to get the hit. And that's normally the sweet spot. With his unarmored defense in, obviously, Pathfinder 2, he would have an armor class of 16 at level 2 because it would have gone up by 1. Now, being trained in unarmored defense doesn't mean that he's like a kung fu martial artist, because it's 3. That's effectively what he's getting there, plus his dex modifier of 2. He's getting the same as from a chain shirt. But really, when you think about it, that is him using a certain amount of common sense and ability and agility to not simply stand there while someone tries to stab him. Because if someone was trying to stab me, I'd probably be ducking, diving, dodging, dipping, dodging, the 5 Ds of dodgeball. If you can dodge a wrench, you can dodge an arrow. If you can dodge a ball, you can dodge a sword. So I quite like how that is now taking an emphasis off the need for armor. Those moments where you don't have to panic at being just a naked character that stands there and lets people stab them to death, which is why you've got an armor class of 11. That's kind of been done away with now, which is a good thing in my book, because no one does that. So why did the game do that to us? So you're going to have a very, very comparable armor class without the necessity for armor. Armor obviously doesn't add huge amounts. It's not massively swingy in 2e or in 5e. So again, a very similar design ethos there, moving it away from 3.5, where the bulk of your armor, and Pathfinder 1, the bulk of your armor class normally came from your armor. It was the thing that you shored your defense up with, and then you added a shield on top and tried to cheesemonger your way into saying, no, I've got a tower shield and full plate, and I'm going to run with only 300 pounds of equipment. Try it. It'll be tiring. So they come from a very similar design base at that point, except they've taken slightly different routes to it. And that, again, armor proficiency in 5e, that's a bit of a cheeky bonus for sorcerers that don't get any armor class, isn't really needed in 2e, because you're not an idiot. You're not just going to stand there going, oh, I just don't know what to do. You're stabbing me. Oh, it's so terrible that I've got an armor class of 11. You don't have that problem, thank God. Now, from a perspective of spells and things like that, you'll have 1 or 2 more as a 5e character, as a 2e character, than you will as a 5e character. You're going to be exactly the same on spell levels, though. You've got cantrips, 5 cantrips, 4 level 1 spells in 2e. How many people are going to get confused between just hearing the E on the end? I know I already am. And then in 5e, I nearly said 4e. What happens then? 6e. It's going to get even more confusing. 3e, 6e. That's the next video in 2 years' time. You've got 4 cantrips and 3 spells. Now, this is the next divergent point. More spells is great, and yes, that's excellent, and there is an argument to kind of say that 1 extra spell at each point is really useful because that's more flexibility, that's more ability to have options to have something up your sleeve as a sorcerer. Magic is your primary bag, but we've got that the sorcery points in 5e that enable you to essentially meet that same kind of ground by getting an extra spell slot. So you're not actually that far behind, and the spells are very similar. They're all still roughly based on the 3rd edition D&D spells, same as Pathfinder 1. And they're all mostly kind of Tolkien and kind of common fantasy kind of magical tropes that have been everywhere and anywhere. But this is the interesting bit. Matt Mercer had to use Xanathar's Guide to change up what he could do with his bloodline, because in the 5e core book, you've got 2 choices, Draconic and the other one, and I don't see a lot of people hyping up the other one on the old interwebs. And that's it. You've got Draconic, which is your lead-in one, and then you've got like the Chaos one, where you've got that table to roll on, which just looks like a bit of a pain in the backside, to be honest with you. And then roughly you've got 3 more in Xanathar's Guide to Everything. I thought there'd be more, but there's only 3, and Divine Soul is one of them, and that essentially gives you access to the Divine Casting Pool and gives you that kind of a cleric bend on your sorcerer's kind of power. In the Pathfinder 2 and Pathfinder 1 kind of context of the game, there's a lot more. I mean, for Pathfinder 1 now, the amount of time that's been out, it's been out a very long time. It's older than 5e. I mean, the amount of Bloodlines out for that is bonkers. But in the Pathfinder 2 core rulebook, there's 10 Bloodlines. That's a lot more choice than Matt had. One of them is Angelic, which is effectively divine, and it gives you heal spells and access to the divine spell list, but it also gives you 2 extra skills like 5e backgrounds do, as well as 2e backgrounds also giving you 2 extra skills. So there's another little divergent point just at that little level where your background, your bloodline grants you bonus skills to give you more depth to your character's kind of reason for power and ability to know about that power and have an understanding of the world they're operating in. Those 10 are all very different. You've got obviously Angelic, which is, like I said, Divine Soul. It's essentially just a knockoff cleric in both systems. Let's be brutally clear about that. Play a cleric, do the same job. Play a sorcerer, knock off the cleric. But you've got Hag is in there. You can be a hag, like, imbued sorcerer, which would probably be quite horrible. Undead is in there. You can go straight necromancer out the gate. Boom. Murder hobo central. I murder them, and then I bring them back as zombies, and I use them to kill more people, who I then raise as skeletons, and the murder hoboing goes on forever. In a never-ending tide of necromantic, unless you meet that dwarf who's got that resilience kind of feat against undead, and then he'll probably deck you. So stay away from him. But there's Imperial, which is very mystical and very kind of ancient kind of gods and beings of godly power beyond the realms of history, which sounded cool. What else was in there that was cool? Obviously, Draconic's in there. Yes, it's very similar because they're dragons, and dragons are dragons. But yeah, those 10, there's a lot going on. Well, obviously, there's demons and devils. So you can get straight in on that. Again, those bloodlines have those kind of quirks and traits that you see in 5e, where you get like the dragon scales, or if you're a draconic sorcerer, difference being in 2e that has an impact in game, and when you use your blood magic, i.e. a spell cast from your magical school, you gain a bit of fire resistance, well, a bit of resistance based on your dragon type, for example, using draconic as an example. So you just get a slightly more filled out bloodline. The 5e bloodlines, there's not many of them. The 5e bloodlines are perfectly fine. Again, They are adventure muck adventure face complete. But if you're bored of the few that there are, there's a lot more choice baked into the core rulebook of 2E by a country mile, and there's quite a few added in books. And later this year, there is a book coming out solely dedicated to magic and magic classes, which has got a couple of extra cool classes in it and a load of new spells and magic items in it. And this is one of the really big things about 2E that I can't stress enough. 2E already has parity with 5E in terms of volume and scale of options for subclasses, archetypes, whatever terminology you want to use to describe an option for a class or an item or a spell. 2E is already level pegging, probably actually maybe creeping past 5E already, much like Pathfinder 1 did. And it's still getting more content, and it's still very early doors. It's only been out, 2 years? And it's already really meteorically moving past, in terms of volume of content for its players, what you have in 5e. That's not me being mean. I'm not saying that makes it better. I'm simply telling you there's a lot of content already in play and already planned. And loads of adventure paths, if you're into that. I'm not. You might be. There's loads of them. Enjoy them. Enjoy them, god damn it. But obviously from that perspective, you can see how it's only going to keep coming. And inevitably 5e has been a tour de force. With the amount of marketing money they've spent on it, they've got their return. But they have spent a lot of money marketing it to get it there, because it's not Wizards of the Coast, it's Hasbro. And Hasbro own everything. Monopoly, for example, they own that. I mean, there's nothing they don't own as far as I can tell. They probably own me, I just haven't found out yet. But inevitably, 5e, like all products, has a life cycle, and it goes up, and it peaks, and then it comes down, and we may have just hit the peak, because there's not that much more content they can create for it, and they don't really like creating a lot of content for it regards kind of feats and items and things like that, because they're very worried about balance. They've said this themselves in interviews on the D&D podcast. It's great. I listen to it all the time. The D&D lore is wonderful stuff. I played 3.5 for donkeys. That means a long time, by the way, if you're not British. Donkey's years. I don't know why. It just does. I didn't make the phrase. Don't blame me. But from that perspective, 6E's coming. It has to. In the next couple of years, it has to happen. So if you're in that kind of interim period and you've gone a bit stale on 5e and you've played the same Mountain Dwarf 20 times, 2e. It's very familiar, but more than different enough to re-engage and re-energize. And that's really what this is about. If you only play 5e and you're never going to play any other system and you just think 5e is the best thing in the world, that's nice. There are other systems, but if you just don't want to, and you just want to have the blinkers on and go 5e, 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 then I'm not going to change your mind. It's a shame, because you're missing out on loads of great games like Feng Shui, which is absurd. But you are where you are and you're happy. Brilliant. All power to you. But if you're sat on the fence and you're like, actually, I can only play the same character so many times before I can't do any more with my fluff and my narrative because my mechanics hold me back. 2E? Come on over. It's really good. Don't let the other 5e players hear you. They'll crucify you. They won't do that at all. Actually, they probably will. No, that's a joke. They won't. They're lovely people, and everyone in the chat's going to be really nice and civil. Thank you. No, 2E's better because. No, 5E's better because it will be a never-ending war of nerds, and I can't be bothered with that. Now, to kind of, I suppose, wrap out where the kind of the differences kind of, I suppose, end, that's probably about where we've got to. They cover very similar ground, and they look at very similar mechanics and very similar questions about how you resolve things at the table, and they come at it from slightly different perspectives. They're both Tolkien inspired, they're both Gygax based. They're not remotely Gygax at all, because he hated magic users. That's why when I played 3rd edition, being a magic caster was a death sentence. You got no hit points, you got no abilities, your initial spells ran out quicker than you could cast them in the first encounter, and then you hid at the back with a crossbow being rubbish until you, if you were lucky, survived to level 4 or 5 when you could finally be useful. Those times have gone in both 5e and 2e, and so both systems get a great big thumbs up from me, because there's long been this argument about how the focus should be on melee combatants, or the focus should be on ranged combatants, or casters are too overpowered. And it's like, there's only so much balancing you can do before the guy who can cast and summon meteors from the sky is going to be a dominant force in your party. He's not going to be the greatest athlete. He's not going to be the biggest, hardest tank that's ever been. But there has to be some level of balance. And both do a really good job of reflecting that. Because if you were to touch stone on hit points before someone starts going, no, because your sorcerer's got 2,468 million hit points at level 1 and is invincible with a nuclear armor class and nothing could ever kill him. It's not true. If you played that same dwarf with the explodey power ability, and he was just a really cool double-hard explodey dwarf, because he was touched by the spirit of Angrad, and he was playing a champion, which in 5e is called Paladin, and then that's it. We'll do another video about that at some point. You get 10 hit points from your ancestry and 10 hit points from your class, and then you add your con. So your sorcerer's down there at kind of 18 hit points going, I feel pretty tough, I'm a dwarf. If they were an elf sorcerer, they'd have 12 plus their con modifier. Now, you're not telling me that doesn't already give you wonderful enhanced kind of thematic resemblance of how you want your world to be. We know that dwarves are robust and tough and mighty, and we know that elves are intelligent and swift and eloquent and fragile and delicate and beautiful. That really sets it up. When you're coming in and you're like, oh yeah, I'm an elf sorcerer and I've got like 14 hit points, and the dwarf kind of laughs and says, I'm, a dwarven fighter and I've got 24. Boom. And they're both level 1. That's exciting to me. That tells me that this guy's going to have to work really hard to keep this guy alive. And there you go. Your party's got a binding point. So hopefully this has given you a bit of an insight into how the two systems handle Sorcerer. And I am going to put in the comment section below the alternative 2E criminal, let's get it correct, criminal background based dwarf sorcerer built in Pathfinder 2 as a PDF character sheet. So if you're literally about to go to a Pathfinder 2 game and you've not got a character and you watched Exandria and thought it was really cool, just literally print it, turn up and be like, oh, he's called Dariax, the criminal sorcerer, and see if you get away with it. You're not going to get away with it, but it's worth a blag, and it's your character, even though I made it, and I didn't make it. Matt Mercer did. It's all Matt Mercer's fault. So, enjoy the next episode of Exandria. Hopefully this has given you some kind of gauge point on those where you get to make choices between 5e and 2e. But I'm going to leave you with this little bombshell, because you've stayed to the end. And it's quite a big bombshell. From level 2 to 20 in 5e, you will have 13 class features, some of which will be given to you and dictated to you by choices you make early in the game. In Pathfinder 2, level 2 to level 20 is 60. Now, I think there was someone out there who said there was an illusion of choice in Pathfinder 2. That may be a bit of a white lie. 60 features across 19 levels. Some of them will be given to you and dictated to you by choices you make early on, just like in 5e. The rest won't. The rest you'll have quite a lot of freedom to choose. So like I said, if you're sat on the fence and 5e's getting a bit long in the tooth because it's a little bit old now and looking like it's kind of running its kind of course, 2e, it's where it's going to be for the next 5 years. And there's a lot of content. Jump in, stay safe, stay well, stay classy. And of course, I will see you on the next video. Peace out.